So I was scrolling through LinkedIn recently when I came across a post from, I think it's the founder of a Nigerian startup called I Do. I'm guessing it's a play on the words I do, which are said when one is getting married. It's spelled AIIDO. So the idea is simple enough: build a platform where couples can plan their weddings, discover vendors, choose venues, manage everything from start to finish, and eventually become the default wedding platform in Nigeria and perhaps even Africa. And honestly, on paper, it sounds incredibly exciting. The Nigerian wedding industry is worth over a trillion naira annually. There's no dominant player. Young people are digital first. Africa is young. The opportunity is massive. Those are compelling arguments. But then I started asking myself a different question. Does it make sense to build a platform for an industry that runs almost entirely on trust? Because maybe, hear me out, right? Just maybe the absence of a dominant player isn't a market failure. Maybe it's the market working exactly as intended. Let's talk about it. The first assumption that gets made in tech is this: big market plus no dominant company equals massive opportunity. But that isn't always true. Sometimes a huge fragmented market means nobody has managed to crack the trust problem. Think about weddings in Nigeria. When was the last time you heard someone say, "Oh, I found my wedding photographer on an app," or "I discovered my caterer through an online marketplace"? Most people don't do that. They ask their friends, colleagues, family members, church members, or more commonly, they hire a wedding planner, and the wedding planner handles everything. The planner already has a trusted network. They know which decorators deliver, they know which photographers show up on time, they know which caterers won't embarrass them. They even have tiers of vendors and know who to recommend for a 10 million naira wedding versus a 100 million naira wedding. Those relationships have been built over years, sometimes decades. And interestingly, this lines up with an idea from the economist Ronald Coase. Coase argued that organizations exist because they reduce what he called transaction costs. The cost isn't just money, it's the cost of searching, verifying, negotiating, coordinating, and managing risk. And when you think about it, that's exactly what wedding planners do. They reduce the transaction cost of organizing one of the most important days of your life. We've already done the vetting, they've already built the relationships, they've already made the mistakes so that you don't have to. And that's important because a wedding isn't just another purchase, it's one of the biggest days of your life. The cost of getting it wrong is enormous. Nobody wants to experiment. Nobody wants to be the person that says, well, the app gave them 5 stars after things just scatter. Trust matters more than choice. Now, the second assumption is one I hear all the time. Millennials and Gen Z are digital natives. Therefore, they expect digital solutions. Do they really? That's quite a leap. Being comfortable with technology doesn't mean wanting technology involved in every aspect of life. We use banking apps because banks are standardized. We use ride hailing apps because if one driver cancels, another driver is just 5 minutes away. Order our food online because the downside is relatively small. If your shawarma arrives cold, I mean, life goes on. But weddings, that's different. Behavioral economists have a concept called loss aversion. The basic idea is that people feel the pain of losses much more intensely than the joy of equivalent gains. The upside of discovering a slightly better photographer through an app is relatively small, but the downside of having terrible wedding photos for the rest of your life is catastrophic. So people become far more conservative when the stakes are high. They rely on trusted networks, and let's be honest, most Nigerian millennials and Gen Z couples are not planning their weddings in isolation. Parents are involved, extended families, churches, and in many cases, parents are actually funding a significant portion of the event, if not the whole event. So even if the couple wants a digital solution, are they actually the ones calling the shots? Or are they operating within a much older system built on relationships and referrals? That's an important distinction. Economists call this the principal agent problem. The person using a product isn't always the person paying for it, and the person paying for it isn't always the person making the final decisions. In Nigerian weddings, you often have multiple stakeholders with different preferences and priorities. That makes building a digital solution much more complicated than it first appears. The user isn't always the buyer, and the buyer isn't always the decision maker. Then there's another assumption that caught my attention: the idea that young Nigerians are comfortable paying for software that meets their needs. That's largely true, but what need exactly are we talking about? Who says they are willing to pay for wedding software? Let's think about it. A couple might happily pay hundreds of thousands of naira for a planner, millions for photography, millions for catering, millions for decorations. But does that automatically mean they will pay for a planning platform? Not necessarily, because the planner already performs that function. A software isn't removing an existing cost, it's potentially adding a new one. And that's where many tech products struggle. They create convenience without eliminating pain. The question every startup must answer is this: what painful, expensive problem disappears if I exist? If that answer isn't obvious, adoption becomes difficult. I think the biggest misunderstanding, though, is assuming that wedding planning is fundamentally a discovery problem, that people simply need better access to vendors. I don't think that's true. I think weddings are a trust problem, and wedding planners are essentially professional risk managers. When a planner recommends a vendor, they are putting their own reputation on the line. They are saying, I trust this person enough that if something goes wrong, my name is attached to it. That is incredibly powerful, much more powerful than online reviews. French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu described something called social capital, the idea that relationships themselves carry value, that trust, reputation, and social connections are assets that people can draw upon. When your aunt recommends a photographer, she's effectively lending her social capital to that person. Her reputation becomes part of the transaction. That's something a five-star rating on an app struggles to replicate. Because let's be honest, in Nigeria, people don't necessarily trust ratings. People trust people. Your auntie's recommendation carries more weight than 500 online reviews. The photographer who did your cousin's wedding has already been trusted. The caterer from your church members' event has already been validated. The trust work has already been done. But see, it goes deeper than that because that trust also doubles as a subtle warning. Think about it. When someone calls a vendor, the very first thing they say is, "Hi, I'm Emeka, and I was referred to you by my cousin that you covered last November." On the surface, it's a polite introduction, but what they're actually saying is, I know exactly what you delivered for my cousin. That is the exact standard that I expect. So don't even think about misbehaving with my event. It's an unspoken social contract. It is accountability. An app can't easily replicate that. This isn't unique to weddings. Think about how many industries operate almost entirely on referrals: mechanics, builders, electricians, real estate agents, domestic staff, schools, doctors. The list is endless. These are huge markets, yet many remain stubbornly resistant to complete digitization. Why? Because the product itself isn't just the service, the product is trust. And trust, especially in environments where standardization is weak, is incredibly difficult to platform. The inefficiency is often the feature, not the bug. Now, having said all of this, does that mean there's absolutely no opportunity here? Not at all. But I think the entry strategy for anyone who wants to win in this market needs to change completely. If you want to succeed in this business, you shouldn't try to build something that bypasses the wedding planner. You need to build something for the wedding planner. Because here's an insider reality from the supply chain. I run an ice cube manufacturing factory here in Abuja, and we service, give or take, 50-60% of cocktail vendors in the city. Now, when you look at the mechanics of how these events actually get executed, you quickly realize where the true power lies. It's with the wedding planners. They wield an incredible amount of influence. They are not just organizing the day, they control the ecosystem. They dictate which vendor gets hired, which means they indirectly control whose ice gets bought. They are the gatekeepers of the vendor network. So trying to disrupt them or cut them out isn't just difficult, it's actually bad business. And this brings me to one final idea. Most technology companies obsess over something called network effects. The idea that a platform becomes more valuable as more users join. But some industries operate on something completely different: trust effects. The value doesn't come from having the biggest network, it comes from having the most credible relationships, the strongest referrals, the deepest reputations, the most reliable gatekeepers. And trust effects are harder to digitize than network effects. The most sustainable entry into the Nigerian tech space for weddings isn't trying to convince a bride or her traditional parents to trust an app. It's convincing the planner that your software can make their job 10 times easier. So maybe the future isn't come to our app and discover vendors. Maybe it's a powerful operational dashboard that says to the planner, bring your existing trusted vendors to our platform so that you can track everything without losing your mind. The trust can remain human, but the logistics can become digital. So by building for the gatekeepers, you aren't fighting the trust infrastructure of the market. You are directly plugging into it. And historically, The businesses that empower the power brokers are often the ones that survive. So, does it make sense to build a platform for an industry that runs on trust? Maybe, but perhaps the real opportunity isn't digitizing trust, it's digitizing everything around it.